I'm going to go through his career chronologically and then talk about my favorite films, the 5 films I think most sum up his career and are the best films in his filmography at the end. So first off, Matthau got his start in theater. It's where he met Neil Simon. It's where he met Ossie Davis. And he had a brief stint in television, I think starting on the Mr. Peepers show, and eventually being brought into the world of movies because he was a tall man with a presence, but he wasn't good looking. And Burt Lancaster thought, oh, that'll be a good person to have as the villain in my film, The Kentuckian. So that was the first movie that Walter Matthau was in. If you look at the opening credits, he is introduced, quote unquote, in The Kentuckian. Movie's not great. When I saw this, it was my first exposure to Burt Lancaster, and I thought, this guy is the most boring man in Hollywood. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit later who the actual most boring man in Hollywood is, but at the time I thought it was him, and I hadn't yet seen The Secret to My Success or anything like that. I had only seen The Kentuckian. Holy crap, is it boring. Jake, do you have any kind of relationship with Burt Lancaster? Have you seen any of his movies?
Burt Lancaster, yeah, I've seen From Here to Eternity. Oh gosh, I've only seen 2 of his movies. That's crazy. So From Here to Eternity and then Field of Dreams are actually the only 2 Burt Lancaster movies I've seen. I swore I'd seen more. Maybe I just don't have a mark on Letterboxd, but I have seen Burt Lancaster in From Here to Eternity, which I think is great. We'll be covering that on the podcast on a future episode.
Let me start by saying he's barely in Field of Dreams. Very small role.
Very small role, but it's important. But yeah, it's a small part.
And that was very late in his career.
One of his last, I think it was his last movie.
Yeah, that makes sense. In The Kentuckian, he's a total snooze. And the movie's a snooze. It's about a guy and his son who are pioneers, basically, and they get stopped up in this town because they're helping this girl. And Walter Matthau is the bartender in this town, and he's kind of a town leader. And anyway, the only interesting parts of this movie are there's a fight scene where Walter Matthau, holding a whip, fights Burt Lancaster, who's unarmed. And then shortly after that, there's a sort of shootout scene where a guy tries to shoot Burt Lancaster from across a lake. He misses. And in the time it takes him to reload his gun, Lancaster runs across the lake and attacks him. That's a very cool shot. There's nothing else interesting in this movie. It's a 2-star film. But then Kirk Douglas got the idea that having this big, ugly guy Matthau as the villain in my movie might work out for me. So he brought in Matthau to be in The Indian Fighter, which is better than The Kentuckian, but not by a ton. Kirk Douglas plays another frontiersman who has a good relationship with the Sioux tribe that's near the encampment of white people, essentially. Walter Matthau and one of his cronies is selling whiskey to the Sioux, and that causes problems. Good, not great. In fact, I wouldn't recommend. Not the most interesting movie. I know you have a big relationship with Kirk Douglas, though.
Of course, yeah. I mean, I've seen Spartacus and Paths of Glory, the Kubrick films, and Kirk Douglas is great. And of course, Michael Douglas is one of our many mascots from the show. We've talked about several of his movies here, but yeah, Kirk Douglas is one of the all-timers.
Can't wait to get our Michael Douglas merchandise for everybody.
Got any day now.
So the next year, James Mason did a movie called Bigger Than Life. Now, I've recently heard people talk about this movie in glowing terms. Mason essentially becomes very ill and has to go on medicine. And the medicine is something like a steroid. It makes him feel gigantic. He's filmed as if he's gigantic. And Walter Matthau plays his neighbor friend. He's not doing much yet. And I've heard people talk about this movie like it's some great example of what steroid use could do to you. I heard it compared to Love Live Bleeding in that way. But Bigger Than Life is a snooze. The only thing that's interesting about it, and I've talked about it on this podcast before, actually, the guy who plays James Mason's son in this movie is Christopher Olsen. Mason threatens to kill Olsen in the movie. Christopher Olsen is also the little boy in the remake of The Man Who Knew Too Much, where he is threatened to be killed by terrorists.
Oh.
So he's still got Matthau only as a supporting character, but he does it much better in his next film, A Face in the Crowd. Now, this was directed by Elliot Kazan. This movie has more notoriety than anything he's done before, and it stars Andy Griffith as almost like a Donald Trump type figure. Like if Donald Trump was like a Southern hayseed and the country became enamored of him, that's who this character would be. And in the same way, this character is pulled into the world of politics as the movie goes on because politicians want to get him on their side so they can leech off his popularity. And Matthau plays a TV producer who is wary of Griffith's demagoguery. And he's very good. And I think this was probably the first time a lot of people took notice of Matthau. Because his next movie is Slaughter on 10th Avenue, starring the actual most boring man in the history of Hollywood, Richard Egan. Oh, this guy stinks. This movie is such a bore, as middle of the road as it can get. And Walter Matthau essentially plays like a mafia type union buster. And Richard Egan is an attorney who wants to help the unions. First off, you can't find it anywhere. It basically doesn't exist. I'm not going to tell you where I found it. I don't recommend it at all, but I do very much recommend the next movie that Matthau was in 1958. It was called King Creole. It was directed by Michael Curtis, who's more famous for directing Casablanca, and it starred Elvis Presley, who's more famous for being Elvis Presley. But the reason this movie is so interesting is because Walter Matthau essentially plays the Dennis Hopper role in Blue Velvet. Blue Velvet is almost a remake of King Creole, and I never see anyone saying this online except for me. I find it very frustrating because Carolyn Jones is essentially playing the Isabella Rossellini character. Elvis Presley is playing the Kyle MacLachlan character. And Dolores Hart is essentially playing the Laura Dern character. These two women who vie for different parts of Elvis's soul. You know, one is sexy and mysterious, and the other is very wholesome and pretty. And then you've got Walter Matthau as the controlling gangster who controls the darker, more mysterious woman's life. And it's nefarious like that. Very cool. The only thing missing from Blue Velvet that was in this was Kyle MacLachlan's dad getting wrapped up in the controversy. After this, Matthau was in another Richard Egan movie that was even worse than the first one. It's called Voice in the Mirror. Oh, this movie was bad. Egan plays a guy who is an alcoholic, and movie is essentially about the beginning of Alcoholics Anonymous, and Matthau plays his doctor who sort of advises him against doing this spiritual stuff as a way of handling his alcoholism. Movie sucks. Don't watch it. The next movie he was in also sucks. It was called Onionhead. This is the movie that killed Andy Griffith's film career. That's how bad it was. Andy Griffith plays a Navy guy. Matthau is like the head of the mess hall. Honestly, the less said about this, the better. None of it makes any sense, except that the female lead was Felicia Farr, who went on to marry Jack Lemmon. Maybe there's something there with how Matthau and Lemmon came to be together, although I think it was just Neil Simon who got them together in the end. Next up is a surprisingly fun one. This was called Ride a Crooked Trail. It starred Audie Murphy, who was if you've seen the movie Inglourious Bastards, you've seen the Daniel Bruhl character. He plays a Nazi soldier who comes home and becomes a movie star. This is pretty much what Audie Murphy's story was on the American side in real life. He was a World War II hero, came home, became an actor. He was pretty decent. Not great, but pretty decent. If I had been in charge of Hollywood at the time, I would have probably put him in funnier stuff. He is kind of he's a little guy, was a little guy. I would have put him in more goofy stuff. Matthau plays a judge who's also like he's basically the judge and the sheriff and the ranger of this town that Audie Murphy, who's a bank robber, ends up in. He mistakes Audie Murphy for a sheriff or for a ranger and wants Audie Murphy to help him clean up the town. It's a lot of fun. There's like a whole secret identity piece to it. This one's worth checking out. I'm pretty sure it's available in a Blu-ray or DVD box set of 3 Audie Murphy movies. Pick it up. It's worth it. Okay, I don't know really how to talk about the next movie that Matthau starred in because it's also the only movie he ever directed. It's called Gangster Story. It's very bad. Matthau plays a gangster and a cop killer, and he did not know what he was doing. He directed this film, and it was trash. From scene to scene, it looks bad. It looks very amateurish. He said it was the worst movie he was ever in. I think there are 2 that are worse that I'll talk about in a minute, but this is really close to the bottom of the barrel. Unfortunately, this movie is available everywhere. I think it might even be in the public domain, even though it hasn't been the requisite, 75 or 90 years? Oh, this movie is so bad. Anyway, it's on Tubi, it's on Prime Video if you want to torture yourself, but it stinks. It's not even so good it's bad, it's just bad. Then he reunited with Kirk Douglas for a non-Western called Strangers When We Meet. Matthau plays a very interesting character in this. He plays like the neighborhood lech, and you don't know that that's what he's about until pretty deep in the movie. The movie is about Douglas having an affair with Kim Novak. His wife is played by Barbara Rush, and Matthau gets wind of this affair going on, and his character completely changes, and he becomes this like evil, nefarious, lecherous, gross guy who tries to have sex with Barbara Rush. So the third act of the movie is pretty interesting. Unfortunately, it takes a long time to get there. Matthau's next movie was also with Kirk Douglas. It was called Lonely Are the Brave. This one's really good. They don't share a single scene together. Douglas plays a cowboy, but this movie takes place in 1962 when it came out. One of the very first shots is of Douglas laying in the grass looking up at the sky, and you see an airplane fly by. And that's your way of knowing that this isn't your regular Western. Douglas breaks into a prison to try to break one of his friends out, but his friend doesn't want to get in that much trouble, so Douglas just breaks himself out. And the rest of the movie is Matthau as the sheriff on the trail of Douglas as this escaped cowboy. And it has a really dark ending. I actually think this movie is very good. Not a top 10 Matthau movie, but probably a lot of people would consider it as such. This career is like a roller coaster, because next is Who's Got the Action. This is a Dean Martin starring movie. It's just an excuse to have Martin go whoopie-doopie-doo the whole time. Martin is a serial gambler, and Matthau plays a gangster who is also a bookie and doesn't like this. Honestly, the plot is so convoluted, and the movie's not good enough to get into it. Skip it. It's not that good. Although It's better than the next movie that Matthau was in called Island of Love. So up until the early 60s, we're still like not getting Matthau at his best. We are getting Matthau playing now comedic villains instead of hard-boiled villains. So at least people are starting to get a sense that he could be funny. But Island of Love is such a snooze. It stars Robert Preston as a lech who thinks he can get rich off of convincing people that this particular Greek island is the legendary island of love. And Matthau, for some reason, has a lisp in this movie. It's completely unforgivable. I think about this and I get hives. It's not funny. It's really irritating. I feel bad that Jake has to even hear me talk about this. He's on mute right now because he's eating an apple because I told him I was going to rant about bad Matthau movies for a while. Ugh, skip. That is the second worst Matthau movie. It is worse than Gangster Story, but not as bad as the number one worst movie, which I'll get to in a little while once we get to the 80s, another slump for Matthau. Now, the next movie is not my favorite, although I think it is a lot of people's favorite early Matthau movie. It's Charade. It was directed by Stanley Donen. It stars Cary Grant and Audrey Hepburn and has really fun supporting roles from James Coburn, George Kennedy, the man, if you ask me, of the 60s and 70s, and Ned Glass. These guys are a trio of criminal spy types who are after a ton of money, and they all think that Cary Grant and Audrey Hepburn have it because Audrey Hepburn's deceased husband had it, and there's a secret lead villain that you don't find out until the end, and I won't spoil it because it's very cool. The movie's great, but it's got a very old Cary Grant, and you can feel he's kind of running out of gas at this point. Okay, this next movie is super weird. So in the 50s, there was a movie called Mr. Roberts, and it's a Navy comedy starring Jack Lemmon, Henry Fonda, and William Powell. And it was, I think, a fairly big hit. 9 years later, they made a sequel, had none of the original cast come back. And instead of Jack Lemmon as the character Ensign Pulver, they got Robert Walker Jr. to play the role. Instead of James Cagney playing Captain Morton, they got Burl Ives to play the captain, which actually worked. Instead of Powell, they got Walter Matthau to play the doctor. And the spoiler alert for Mr. Roberts, the Henry Fonda character had died. They didn't need to replace him. This is just like a very strange sequel that follows a lot of the same beats as the original. It's pretty fun. It's cool that Matthau showed up in a sequel of a Jack Lemmon movie. They still haven't gotten together in a movie yet at this point. I would recommend searching this one on YouTube and watching that stream of it. Pretty good. Now, next up is Fail Safe. It was directed by Sidney Lumet. It starred, ironically, Henry Fonda as the president of the United States. And Matthau played a sort of think tank running professor. And the whole movie is about atomic paranoia. A lot of people compare it to Dr. Strangelove. It's more serious than Dr. Strangelove. And it has an equally depressing ending. I highly recommend people check this out. Very, very good. Probably a top 10 Matthau movie. Okay, next up is Goodbye Charlie. This was one of Matthau's team ups with Tony Curtis. This one's pretty strange. Curtis, this movie is like, okay, stay with me here. The titular Charlie dies in the beginning of the movie because he's having an affair with Walter Matthau's wife, and Matthau chases him off of a cruise ship that they're on and maybe shoots him and kills him. Anyway, he dies. And his spirit incarnates in Debbie Reynolds' body. And then the whole movie is Charlie as Debbie Reynolds bothering Tony Curtis and Tony Curtis not knowing how to deal with it. I don't know why this movie hasn't been reclaimed by the trans community because it feels like an allegory. Anyway, Matthau plays like a skeezy film producer here. Check it out. It's kind of interesting. It's not great, but it's kind of interesting. Next up, Matthau supported Gregory Peck in a movie called Mirage. This is a spy thriller, sort of. The problem with this one is the whole plot sort of falls apart by the end, and also Matthau's sidekick character dies in the middle of the movie. So when he died, I couldn't believe it. I was like, you could have gotten so much more Matthau out of this movie, and they just decided not to. Anyway, the resolution of the mystery is so disappointing that I can't in good conscience recommend checking this one out. But the next movie up is very important. It's called The Fortune Cookie. We talked about this one quite a bit on the Random Acts of Cinema podcast that we went on. This is the first time that Billy Wilder, Jack Lemmon, and Walter Matthau all teamed up. First time Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau teamed up, period. Lemmon plays a sports cameraman who gets tackled on the sidelines of a football game, gets a small injury, and his shyster lawyer brother-in-law, played by Walter Matthau, wants to milk it for millions of dollars. The set that most of this movie takes place on is the same set as the set of The Apartment, which we learned on the Random Acts of Cinema podcast. So that's a pretty cool bit of trivia. This movie came out 7 years later. Very important for being both the first team up between these two, and also Matthau won an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for this film. He also had a heart attack on the set of this film.
I didn't know that.
Yep. It changed his life completely. Stopped smoking, I think cut back on drinking, changed his diet, didn't stop gambling, which the doctors did tell him to do, and showed up to accept his Oscar with a cast on his hand that he claims came from a bike accident. And his very short Oscar acceptance speech references that bike accident.
Interesting.
The next movie he is in is so strange. So it's called A Guide for the Married Man. Why is this movie strange? Because it was directed by Gene Kelly and has zero musical numbers. What's the deal? I don't know.
That sentence, yeah, doesn't compute with me.
Doesn't compute, period. But it
Yeah.
did put Matthau and Kelly together for the first time, which is important for a movie coming up later. I actually like this movie quite a bit. It's very strange. Matthau wants to cheat on his smoke show wife, played by Inga Stevens, who is one of the most beautiful women in Hollywood history. It makes no sense that this oaf, although Matthau plays like a perfectly affable person in this movie, it doesn't make any sense that he would want to cheat on her. He's sort of convinced to cheat on her by Robert Morse, who's one of the ugliest men ever. Although Morse, while convincing Matthau to cheat on his wife, also tells him you have to be very careful. Here's all the rules. And those rules are displayed through various vignettes, some of which star Never Did It mascot Art Carney, and Lucille Ball, and Sid Caesar, and Joey Bishop, Jack Benny. It's got a very cool cast. I think this movie's a lot of fun. It was panned when it came out. I think it's pretty neat. Spoiler alert, Matthau decides not to cheat on his wife in the end, so it all works out.
Smart.
Next up is The Odd Couple, and this is one of Matthau's most famous and most celebrated movies, directed by Gene Saks. It's the movie that launched, I think, into the stratosphere, the partnership between Matthau and Lemmon. Funny enough, Matthau started this role of Oscar Madison on Broadway with Art Carney playing Felix Unger, but here Jack Lemmon plays Felix Unger. It's very good. Have you seen The Odd Couple?
If I haven't, it's been so long, I do not remember it. Yeah, I might have seen the sequel, but I think we're going to talk about that later.
We will. Oh, we must. So the next movie is sort of like a spiritual sequel to A Guide for the Married Man. It's called The Secret Life of an American Wife. I also like this quite a bit. It has been seen by almost no one. Letterboxd doesn't even have like a cumulative score on it.
Oh, wow.
I think it's also like pretty solid. It stars Ann Jackson as a woman who feels like her husband, Patrick O'Neill, just ignores her and she wants to feel sexy. So she contacts Walter Matthau, who plays an unnamed movie star and is the client of Patrick O'Neill, who I think is a press agent. And she goes to have an affair with him in a hotel in New York City. But the whole movie's about will she or won't she sleep with him? And once she does, what does that do to her marriage? And this movie's pretty cute. I am one of 4 people who have reviewed this movie on Letterboxd. It is criminally underseen. I know this movie is on YouTube. Seek it out. It's pretty fun. Okay. Speaking of fun and weird, I've talked about this movie on the podcast before. And I know that because I posted a YouTube short about it that I thought would get a lot of views and it got none. But it's called Candy. It was directed by Chris Marquand, and it is sort of I've described it before as a reverse Barbarella. It's about a girl played by, I don't know how to pronounce her name, but I think it's Eva Aulin. I think she was in like 5 movies, and then she married a oligarch or something. And she plays a high school senior who pretty much gets zapped to Earth from space, except at the same time, John Astin is also her father and her uncle, and she ends up having sex with both of them. She also sleeps with a host of other people in this movie, including Ringo Starr, James Coburn, Marlon Brando. John Huston tries to get a piece. It's super weird. I don't know. Sugar Ray Robinson's in it. It's so bizarre. I had a good time with it, but I could see why people really don't like it. And then next Matthau teamed up again with Gene Kelly to do the musical Hello Dolly, which we talked about quite a bit in our episode that preceded this. Every Wall-E fan should see Hello Dolly. It's a lot of fun. The music's great. Barbra Streisand's kind of a babe in it. It's just wonderful. Now, this is much more up Gene Kelly's alley. I think this one's a lot of fun. I'm glad that you said when we did our episode on Cactus Flower that you would probably seek out Hello Dolly anyway.
Yep, that's the plan.
And then next up is Cactus Flower. I'm not going to go too much into it because we talked about it at length in our previous episode, but very, very good. Jake and I both like that one a lot.
Yep.
And then next up is A New Leaf. Now, this is one of the, I think, 4 or 5 films directed by Elaine May, known for being the writing partner of Mike Nichols. She wrote and directed The Heartbreak Kid. She wrote and directed Mikey and Nikki. She wrote and directed Ishtar, and that was sort of the end of her career. She was in permanent director jail after that. But she's great, and this movie is really fun. Walter Matthau plays a very affected socialite who finds out he's run out of money and has to marry someone very quickly. And he meets Elaine May, who is just like a clueless woman with more money than she knows what to do with. And the movie is about their relationship. This is like a slapstick comedy. It is bizarre. Matthau's next movie is called Plaza Suite, where he plays 3 different characters, all who, for some reason or another, are in the Plaza Hotel. This is based on a Neil Simon play. It was directed by Arthur Hiller, and Matthau gets to act against Maureen Stapleton in a very funny skit about whether or not he's cheating on her, against Barbara Harris in a skit about whether or not Barbara Harris will cheat on her husband to be with him. But the Barbara Harris vignette of the movie is a lot like The Secret Life of the American Wife. In fact, they're so similar, it's almost creepy. And then he's in a skit with Lee Grant about whether or not their daughter will come out of the bathroom and get married to a young man waiting for her in the lobby of the Plaza, or in the ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. He plays 3 different characters in each of these skits. So if you need a lot of Matthau doing 3 different things, this is Plaza Suite's the place to do it. And then he was in a movie directed by Jack Lemmon called Koch, and he was nominated for Best Actor for this movie. And the most important thing about this movie, about an old man whose family ignores him, so he goes to help a young lady who has an unwanted pregnancy ride out her pregnancy. The most important thing about this movie is there's a scene where Matthau is watching football in bed. Something happens and he points at the screen, and this should be that's the name of the movie meme, instead of the Leonardo DiCaprio shot from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. For this project, I also watched Awake and Sing, a Norman Lloyd production of a stage play. This aired on television. It's pretty bad. The only thing that's even particularly interesting about it is that Matthau acted opposite Ron Rifkin, who showed up in a couple of Matthau movies, and Felicia Farr, who I mentioned before, was Jack Lemmon's wife. So it's nice to see them working together a bunch, but this is boring. It's about a Jewish family on the Lower East Side during the Depression, and there's just like nothing interesting happening here. It doesn't even really belong here because it's it's a stage play as a TV movie. It's like breaking a lot of rules, but whatever.
We're nothing if not thorough on this podcast.
Clearly, my throat's getting dry talking about Matthau movies. But now we're in the 70s, and Matthau teams up with Carol Burnett for the first of 3 times to make Pete and Tilly. I was loving this movie. It's directed by Martin Ritt, who's better known for directing Paul Newman in HUD and Richard Burton in The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. And Martin Ritt was also in that. He played a role in that Awake and Sing play. Anyway, Pete and Tilly's kind of cool. Tilly is this sweet woman who's a little too old for being as relationship averse as she is. And she meets Walter Matthau at a party, and they start a relationship. And even though she knows Matthau's cheating on her, she wants to marry him. And it's just about their lives. The only thing for me that keeps this from being a 4-star movie, in the middle of the movie, they have a kid and their son gets very sick and he ends up getting cancer and dying. And right before he dies, Carol Burnett does this awful monologue where she screams at Jesus for I don't know how long, too long. It's really off-putting. Had that scene not been in there, this would have been maybe in my top 10. But Matthau followed it up with Charlie Varick. You've never seen Charlie Varick, right?
I have not. That's another one, though, that I, along with Hello Dolly, that I would, time allowing, would like to make an effort to see soon.
What did you know before we started doing this podcast? Did you know about Charlie Varick?
Yes, that's definitely one, just title-wise, that I had just heard about, bandied about as one of the more highly regarded of the Matthau filmography. Yeah.
Yeah. So he did 3, I would call 3 more serious movies in the 70s. He was a part of the new Hollywood thing. I mean, Don Siegel directed this movie. Don Siegel, well known for being the director of Dirty Harry. Matthau got in on that. He did this, and I'll talk about the other 2 in a minute. This is the most highly regarded one. He plays a bank robber. His sidekick is played by Andrew Robinson, who's the villain from Dirty Harry, and he's being tracked by Joe Don Baker. The female lead of this movie is Felicia Farr, Jack Lemmon's wife. This is an excellent movie. There's a reason that you had heard of this before. There's a reason people go crazy for Charlie Varick. I bought this movie on Blu-ray. I liked it so much after watching it on Tubi, and I can't wait to watch the making of. There's a feature-length making of documentary that I'm really excited to watch. This movie's incredible. Matthau essentially plays the smartest, most calm bank robber in the world. The next movie he did was a Stuart Rosenberg cop movie called The Laughing Policeman. For all the charm and humor and pacing that Charlie Varick has, The Laughing Policeman has much less. What The Laughing Policeman does have is Bruce Dern swearing a ton. I love Bruce Dern. I think you do too.
I do.
This is more of a Bruce Dern movie than it is a Matthau movie. Matthau is so glum throughout this whole movie that it's kind of a drag, but Dern is doing everything I wish that they had given to Matthau. And in another sense, don't, because Dern does it so well. But it's sort of like a shadow of Charlie Varick, with Matthau on the other side of the law. And then right after that, Matthau did The Taking of Pelham 123, which I think became famous for us because there was a remake starring John Travolta and Denzel.
Denzel. Yep.
I've never seen that, but I love this. So this is Matthau is a subway cop. Basically, he helps run MTA security. His sidekick is Jerry Stiller, and he's trying to stop Martin Balsam, Hector Elizondo, and their leader, Robert Shaw, from doing a heist that involves a subway car. Hector Elizondo plays a real psychopath here, and Martin Balsam is very, very funny. This one is well worth checking out. It's famous for a reason. Stick with me, folks. We're halfway through. Next up, Matthau reunited with Wilder and Lemmon for the front page, a remake of His Girl Friday. I like this more than His Girl Friday. What's funny about this is Lemmon plays the female role in this movie. They gender swap it. So it's not Cary Grant going after his lady, trying to get her to stay because he wants a relationship with her. It's Matthau trying to keep Lemmon because he just thinks he's good at his job.
Well, what's interesting about that too is that Jeff Richardson actually told me this, is that His Girl Friday was based on a stage play that was two males in the lead. So His Girl Friday was one who actually did the original gender swap, and the front page is going back to the original source material.
I had no idea.
Yep. Yeah, Jeff Richardson pointed that out to me, and I've had forgotten to mention it to you until just now.
Susan Sarandon plays Jack Lemmon's would-be fiance, and Vincent Gardenia plays the inept sheriff. But most importantly, I would say, is Austin Pendleton playing the Earl Williams character. He's so good at it. But this is the second collaboration with Carol Burnett. She plays Molly Malloy, who in this version is a prostitute, not just a lady who wishes Earl well. Next up, he had a cameo in Earthquake. He plays a drunk guy. He shows up a bunch, but Earthquake is bad and Matthau's barely in it, so it really shouldn't even be a part of this. Kind of like JFK, except that JFK is not as bad as Earthquake and Matthau has a little bit more to do, but they're his two like cameo appearances. Mm-hmm. But in his next movie, Matthau was once again nominated for a Best Actor Oscar for The Sunshine Boys. This movie is directed by Herbert Ross, who Matthau collaborated with a bunch. George Burns plays opposite Matthau as the other Sunshine Boy. This is so interesting because Burns had a brief career in the movies, then left the movie industry for 40 years, and then came back in old age, right before he turned 80, to be in The Sunshine Boys. And then only because he lived to be 100 years old, he had a 20-year acting career after that. Wow. So pretty wild. Sunshine Boys is quite good, actually. I like it a lot, but not as much as I like his next movie. It's his, I believe, his first of 3 collaborations with director Michael Ritchie. This is The Bad News Bears. You've seen The Bad News Bears, right?
Yep.
You've seen both versions?
I have seen both, yep.
This version is much better.
Probably the original, but I don't think I've seen them since the new one came out. Or not the new one. I mean, it's been 20 years now. I probably think I watched them both when the Linklater version came out. That's probably the last time I saw them. The original is, as far as I remember, better. But the Linklater one's not bad.
It's not bad, but it doesn't have Tatum O'Neal.
Right.
Who lives in the same assisted living community as my neighbor's mom.
Oh, how about that?
Yeah. It doesn't have Jackie Earle Healy, who we talked about a few episodes ago for being someone who was a heartthrob when he was a kid and then grew up to look super weird.
Not so much now, yeah.
And it doesn't have Vic Morrow as a creepy, rude, abusive coach of the more popular team. Anyway, this movie rules. Highly recommend if you haven't seen the original Bad News Bears to check it out. Next up, he teamed up with Martin Ritt again to make Casey's Shadow. Now, I think no one has heard of this movie. I like it a lot. It's Matthau plays a horse trainer. He rears and races horses with his sons. It's just a sweet movie about that. Takes place in a small town. If you like movies with animals, this is a good one. And also like good kid actors here too, which is very rare for the time. Although I just said Tatum O'Neal, who was one of the best ever. So maybe it wasn't so rare for the time. Yeah. Next up, we've talked so much on this podcast about these movies where doctors are sought after romantic partners, and this next movie is called House Calls. It was Matthau's first movie with Glenda Jackson. Matthau plays a surgeon who every woman in the world wants to sleep with. He's recently widowed. And Art Carney plays the head of his hospital, and he's a senile old doctor who everyone's trying to get rid of. And Richard Benjamin, who Matthau first acted with in The Sunshine Boys. Actually, this is really funny. So Matthau and Benjamin play best friends in House Calls. In The Sunshine Boys, Benjamin plays Matthau's nephew because Matthau is playing like 30 years older than his actual age in The Sunshine Boys. Anyway, House Calls is a rom-com about Matthau deciding to settle down with Glenda Jackson. And why wouldn't you? Glenda Jackson is the best.
Yeah.
Matthau teamed up with Herbert Ross again for California Suite, which has a very similar structure to Plaza Suite, except Matthau's only in one of the skits in this one. Bill Cosby's in one of the skits in this one, acting opposite Richard Pryor, which is pretty wild. Matthau is acting against Elaine May again. And once again, he's cheated on his wife and she's going to find out. And that's like the whole bit of Matthau's sketch. But it also has Jane Fonda and Alan Alda in a sketch about whether or not their kid is going to live, which one of them the kid's going to live with. It's pretty cool. It's just like taking the Plaza Suite concept and moving it to California. And then you also have Maggie Smith and Michael Caine in a skit together where Michael Caine is like pretty clearly gay and a beard for Maggie Smith's actress character. This one's cool. It's not as good as Plaza Suite, but it's worth checking out. It's pretty fun. It's on Tubi. And then Matthau did a movie with Julie Andrews and Tony Curtis. So Tony Curtis is the villain in this one. It's sort of like they swapped the roles from Goodbye Charlie. But Matthau plays a bookie and Tony Curtis blackmails him into running a casino with him. They both are in love with Julie Andrews. But all at the same time, this little girl, her father has committed suicide after placing a bet with Matthau, and Matthau gets stuck with her. And so it's really like a cool, like, adult with a kid he doesn't really want to be taken care of movie. It's a remake of a Shirley Temple movie, which I meant to watch and then never got around to. But the little girl in this is good too. And I think this was probably the only movie that she was ever in. It's funny because you see a lot of people showing up over and over again in Matthau movies. Like in this one, Tony Curtis is back, Lee Grant is back. Brian Dennehy's in this one. It's like one of his earlier, I think one of his first roles. He's pretty good in it as like Tony Curtis's bodyguard.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So the kid was played by Sarah Stimson. This was her only role, which was surprising because she was good.
Interesting.
I cried a little bit watching this one. So that's sort of like the end of the great run he had in the 70s, because now it's the 80s. Well, it's not the end of the great run he had, because next is Hopscotch. If you want to hear us talk about Hopscotch, I recommend checking out the Random Acts of Cinema podcast we were on. We talked about it for over an hour. Look there. I don't know. Do you have anything else to add about Hopscotch that you didn't say there?
Nothing we didn't say there. It's just a delightful movie. It kind of sneaks up on you as for how good and enjoyable it is. Yeah, Hopscotch is definitely a highlight of the never did it for this year for me. Or while it was for Random Acts of Cinema, but I had never did it before that. So
for me too. And there's no greater representation of the fall from grace that Matthau had from the 70s into the 80s as going from Hopscotch into Buddy Buddy. So this was the final collaboration between the trio of Matthau, Wilder, and Lemmon. Look, I'm not going to say this movie's awful, because it's not. It's just mid. It's not up to the standards of the other movies that these three made together. Matthau plays a hitman. Lemmon plays a guy who wants to kill himself because his wife left him. They end up in the same hotel and hijinks ensue. It's just kind of dumb. It's the movie that Quentin Tarantino cites as the reason he doesn't want to keep directing after his 10th film.
That's right.
Because Billy Wilder directed till he was too old. What might even be a better representation of the fall from grace is that the team of Matthau and Ronald Neame went from the amazing Hopscotch to the really not amazing First Monday in October. This movie got made because Sandra Day O'Connor was about to become a justice on the Supreme Court. So they made a movie about a woman, a conservative woman, becoming a justice on the Supreme Court. The problem was Sandra Day O'Connor got confirmed earlier than anyone expected, so they rushed this movie to theaters. It is not good. The jokes are bad. It feels like Aaron Sorkin watched this movie a ton growing up, and then it informed his entire worldview. Now, some people will hear that and rush out to see this. I am not one of those people. I did not enjoy this movie. He followed that up with another collaboration with Herbert Ross called I Ought to Be in Pictures, where he plays a failed Hollywood writer whose daughter, played by Dina Manoff, who had done this role on Broadway, comes to find him. His estranged daughter comes to find him in Hollywood. Meanwhile, Matthau has a relationship on again, off again with Anne Margaret, who's going to show up later in the Grumpy Old Man movies. This is all right. Here's the thing. Anne Margaret and Walter Matthau are incredible here. Dina Manoff, who you've probably only ever seen in Grease, is abysmal. And she is really the star of this movie. She's third billed, but she is in almost every frame of this thing. Not good. Like I said, Matthau is really good in it, and Anne Margaret is also like quite good, playing a very against type character, like a very serious character. I don't recommend this one too much. And I don't recommend this next one at all, which is a bummer. So it's another team up with Michael Ritchie, and Matthau is partnering with Robin Williams. And they play two guys who get held up at a diner and have very different reactions to it. Matthau's is to become more introverted, and Robin Williams is to become sort of like doomsday prepper. You would think it's Robin Williams, it's Walter Matthau. This is going to be hilarious. I don't think I laughed one time watching this movie. It was really frustrating. It's not only one of the worst Matthau movies, easily in the bottom 5. It's one of the 100 worst movies I've ever seen. Ooh. So don't let it ever be said that I just geek out for Walter Matthau movies without thinking about it. Same goes for this next one. It was directed by William Asher, and I think it was written by Charles Grodin. He definitely produced it, starring Walter Matthau. It's called Movers and Shakers. This movie is awful. It's about people in Hollywood trying to get a movie made. Grodin narrates the whole thing, but the narration doesn't really have anything to do with what's going on in the movie. It's just like it's saying what people's emotions are, but if you can't get that across through the performances, then don't do it. And that's followed by the worst Walter Matthau movie, Roman Polanski's Pirates, where Walter Matthau plays a pirate. And that's all I'm going to say about
that movie. Yeah, I saw that movie as a kid. I have no almost memory of it, but now that you say that, I remember that movie. Yeah.
I can't believe you've seen it. I really can't believe it. It's one of the worst movies I've ever seen. And it's really, now looking at this in chronological order, I'm really sad that Matthau had this stint of The Survivors, Movers and Shakers, and Pirates that are 3 of the worst movies I've ever seen. And he followed that with The Couch Trip, which is another Michael Ritchie movie. So Dan Aykroyd plays a crazy person who takes over the identity of his own therapist, who's played by David Clennon, and takes a job offered to him by Charles Grodin. And Walter Matthau plays another crazy person who he meets when he goes to California. This is also like pretty bad, but not nearly as bad as the other two. In fact, the first half of The Couch Trip is pretty funny. Dan Aykroyd is quite funny in it, and then it goes completely off the rails in the second half. You're a big Wayne's World fan, right?
Oh yeah, I love Wayne's World.
The girl who plays Garth's dream girl, Donna Dixon,
Yeah.
she's in this as the female lead. She cannot act,
Oh, that's a shame.
but she's very nice to look at.
Yeah.
Oh my God, this run in the 80s is so bad because next is The Little Devil. All right, I'm going to tell you a story of how financially irresponsible I am. So this movie, The Little Devil, it's the only foreign film that Matthau ever made. It's Italian, directed by and starring Roberto Benigni. Matthau plays a priest who does exorcism at the beginning of the movie, but the devil sticks around and bothers Matthau for the rest of the movie. And the devil's played by Roberto Benigni. And it's called Devil, but he's just like a random demon. He doesn't know anything. He's like a goofball. So this movie is in Italian, dubbed in Italian. I found it with English subtitles.
Mm.
Because it's dubbed in Italian, as many pre-modern Italian movies are, Matthau's voice is not in it. It's someone else doing Matthau's voice in Italian.
Mm.
There's an English language version of this movie, and it was released on VHS in Australia. I found a copy. I purchased a copy for $25.
Nice.
It cost me that much money over again to get it shipped to me in America. If you know anything about VHS tapes, you know that I can't play this tape here without an Australian or European tape player. Where am I going to find a VCR period, let alone a European VCR? I'm not.
Right.
So now I'm paying to have it converted to digital. What's wrong with me? Anyway, the whole point is Matthau does the voice. He dubs his own voice in the American version. So these are the lengths I go to really complete this series. I haven't done it yet. The tape's in the mail. What do you think? Did I do a bad thing?
No, I don't think so at all.
Okay.
Not a little bit. Not even a little bit.
So after that run of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 really bad movies, Walter Matthau retreated back to television for the first time in, I think, like, well, at least 20 years, because he did Awake and Sing, but really for the first time since he was in like Atomic Attack, which was, like a Red Scare type TV play. For The Incident. This was directed by Joseph Sargent, who directed The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3. It's pretty good, actually. Matthau plays a lawyer during World War II who has to defend a German prisoner who has been framed of murder in his prison camp, which is near where Matthau lives. And then you find out that there are other Nazis involved, and Matthau gets, but it's like have you seen John Adams?
No, I never did. But I mean, after filming it,
Man. Come on. It's
Yeah.
got your boy.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay, so you should see John Adams. One of the better, more interesting parts of the beginning of that miniseries is when John Adams and this really happened, defends redcoats after the Boston Massacre in court. And this is very similar to that. He's defending this German prisoner, but they lighten it up a bit because in the end, it turns out the real murderers were other Nazis anyway. After that, he made his first movie directed by his son, but this was also a TV movie called Mrs. Lambert Remembers Love. It's very bad. Charles Matthau never directed a good movie. All his movies are schmaltzy and boring. This one's this particular bummer because it starred Matthau and Ellen Burstyn. Spoiler alert, so you don't see it. Ellen Burstyn, they get married, and then Ellen Burstyn dies right after. This is relevant because it comes up again in his filmography. He then made JFK, put in one of the most incredible performances in that cameo. I think it saved his career because shortly after that, Grumpy Old Men comes out, but not before the sequel to The Incident comes out as a TV movie. It's called Against Her Will, An Incident in Baltimore. This is not as good. This one is where a woman is put in a mental institution against her will, and Matthau, as the same lawyer, fights to get her out. This one was directed by Delbert Mann, who is more famous for directing Marty, a movie that we did on Never Did It, and All Quiet on the Western Front, the TV version from the 70s that you watched.
That's right. Yep.
And then, it wasn't Grumpy Old Men that came out after JFK. It was Dennis the Menace. I watched this like 2 days ago thinking this is going to be real bad. It got terrible reviews. Roger Ebert said that Matthau was good, but the movie was trash. He's half right. Matthau's good and the movie is mid. And he specifically called out that Christopher Lloyd's character, Switchblade Sam, shouldn't have been in the movie. And I do agree with that. Have you seen Dennis the Menace?
If I did, it might have been when it came out, but I mean, I don't remember it at all. It was 90. Was that 93? Yeah. So I would have been like 11 or 12. And I was just kind of starting to get out of movies that I thought were like, for kids and, starting to get into stuff like Fargo and The Usual Suspects and that. So it's probably one that I missed.
Right. I think a lot of people thought this was like a ripoff of Home Alone.
Oh.
But I would say it has more like Little Rascals energy. Like the kids are more at that level of acting. They weren't Macaulay Culkin level. It's solid. I gave it 3 stars. I think it's pretty all right.
I mean, I'm jumping the gun. I'm moving a little ahead there because I was 93 and those movies didn't come out until a little bit later. But still, like I was right in that middle kind of ground where I probably wouldn't have seen it at the time.
Well, one thing you probably did see at the time or shortly after was Grumpy Old Men, which came out next. And this is where everyone our age's love affair with Lemmon and Matthau came from. And with good reason. This movie's incredible. In fact, I think I have it underrated at 4 stars. And the reason I rated it there is because there's this storyline between Kevin Pollak and Daryl Hannah that's kind of half-baked that runs throughout the movie. But even more so, there's a storyline that is an eighth-baked that runs throughout the movie, that Kevin Pollak is running for mayor. And one minute he's running for mayor, and the next minute he is mayor, but they never get into anything that's happening with that. And I remember just thinking, like, why is any of that in this movie? But I think this is actually a 4.5-star movie because there's just such undeniable chemistry amongst Matthau, Lemmon, and Anne Margaret. And, of course, Burgess Meredith, who is the unsung hero of this series. And Ozzie Davis is in this too, and he's very good. And his character dies, which is sad because I think he would have been fun in the sequel. But you need him to die because a different actress doesn't show up unless Ozzie Davis's character is gone, although they could have written their way out of that. Anyway, before we get to Grumpier Old Men, we take a little detour back to TV, back to Delbert Man, back to the Incident series with An Incident in a Small Town. This series is completely out of steam by now. Harry Morgan has been in all 3 of these movies, but now he's being accused of the murder of his son-in-law, I want to say. It turns out later that Nick Stahl, as a little boy, I think, killed him. Anyway, this movie's bad. Don't bother. In fact, I would say stop after the first one. Don't even watch Against Her Will. Definitely don't watch An Incident in a Small Town. Definitely don't watch also the next movie that Matthau made. It's called IQ. Now, this is silly. This is Tim Robbins as a car mechanic, Meg Ryan as Albert Einstein's niece, and Walter Matthau as Albert Einstein. And this is a Nora Ephron style rom-com, but it was directed by a guy named Fred Schapisi. They directed Roxanne and 6 Degrees of Separation. He was a comedy director around that time. 6 Degrees of Separation is known as the movie that kind of put Will Smith on the scene. Roxanne is a Steve Martin adaptation of Cyrano de Bergerac. IQ is trash. It's Matthau as Einstein, which you think would be a no-brainer. Ironically, given the subject of the movie, it is a brainer. It's bad.
Yeah, it's a brainer.
Then Walter Matthau gets back together with his son to make The Grass Harp, which is an adaptation of a Truman Capote novella. Jack Lemmon is in this. It's funny. I'm pretty sure in the novella that Mathau's character and Lemmon's character probably never meet, but they deliberately made a very short scene between them in this movie, which is kind of fun. It's the only fun thing about the movie. Ed Furlong plays the main character, a boy with no personality. Near the end of the movie, Matthau proposes to the main character, Piper Laurie, and then she dies almost immediately. So that's a recurring motif in his later movies.
Jeez.
Movie stinks. Don't watch it. Do watch Grumpier Old Men, the sequel to Grumpy Old Men. What was the only thing missing from Grumpy Old Men? Apparently it was Sophia Loren. She's amazing. She's still very hot at this point. And this was at a time when people in their mid to late 60s, for the most part, looked like they were in their mid to late 80s. It's great. Burgess Meredith, I think, should have been nominated for an Academy Award for this one. The woman who plays Sophia Loren's mother in this one, I think in real life was like 5 years older than her, maybe. It's one of those situations. These movies are so much fun together. Grumpy Old Men takes place in the winter. Grumpier Old Men takes place in the summer. You got the 2 seasons. I would watch a million more of these. In fact, I just watched Twins. I'm ready for Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito to remake Grumpy Old Men. I'm ready. I think it's time.
It's time.
I can't think of any other old actors I'd want to do it because you want it to be comedy actors for the most part, and we know DeVito and Schwarzenegger can do comedy.
What about Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart?
I think they might actually be too old. They could play like the grandfather character, like the Burgess Meredith.
Yeah.
But I think they might be too old. It's the same for like Pacino and De Niro. It's like, I think they're too old. Now, granted, both of them have done comedies before, but not like successfully, really. De Niro was funny in Stardust. We've established this.
Mm-hmm.
So this next movie, I wish was actually Mathau's final film, but it wasn't. It's called I'm Not Rappaport. He got to reunite with Ozzie Davis, and this is based on a play, and it feels like a play. And most of the movie is the two of them talking on a park bench, and I'm a big fan of movies where 2 old guys talk to each other. So, Waiting for Godot vibes. We're going to talk about The Sunset Limited on a future episode. It's a Cormac McCarthy play that was adapted into a movie with Samuel L. Jackson and Tommy Lee Jones, directed by Tommy Lee Jones. This has very similar vibes. It has like a weird detour near the end where Craig T. Nelson is threatening Martha Plimpton, so Matthau and Davis try to like act tough with him, and that scene doesn't really work, and it's long. This movie's almost 2.5 hours long, but I think well worth it. Because after that, you get the 1-2 punch of Out to Sea and The Odd Couple 2, directed by Martha Coolidge and Howard Deutsch, who was the director of Grumpier Old Men. But these 2 movies are pretty bad. These were like squeezing the last drops of whatever they could get out of Matthau and Lemmon as a team, and they don't work. Out to Sea is kind of cute and funny, but mostly just weird. And The Odd Couple 2 is like pretty bad and boring. What can you do? I wish he had gone out with I'm Not Rappaport. It didn't happen. And then there's 2 more movies. There's The Marriage Fool, which was his last collaboration with his son, also his last collaboration with Carol Burnett, and his first collaboration with John Stamos. Didn't go well. It's a pretty bad movie about old people getting married again and their kids not understanding. And then this broke my heart. His final film is a weird one. It was called Hanging Up. It stars Meg Ryan, Diane Keaton, and Lisa Kudrow, and Matthau, of course. Diane Keaton directed it, but I don't know why, because it was written and produced by the Ephron sisters, Nora and Delia Ephron. And it feels like a movie that Nora Ephron would have directed. And I don't know why she didn't, because the movie that she directed that came out that same year, Lucky Numbers. Yeah.
Not very good, as far as I remember.
Well, Lisa Kudrow's in that too. So it's not like it interfered with Lisa Kudrow's schedule. So why would it have interfered with Nora Ephron's schedule? So I actually don't understand. The movie feels very manic in a way that feels like Diane Keaton, but doesn't make for a good movie, which is a shame because Matthau and Ryan are actually doing very good work in this.
Mm-hmm.
But the movie just feels like, it feels like someone's making that sound at you. Matthau dies at the end of old age.
Oh.
And then he died like 6 months after it came out.
Oh, a bummer.
So it was like the end of this movie was a tough one for me to watch. He looks much older here than he did in any of his other movies. He had taken a year break before making this. The last known video of him is video that his son took of him asking, what's the best and worst thing you've done in your life? And he looks very sick. He says both the best and worst thing he did in his life was having his son.
Oh,
he's trying to be funny. And that's his career, which I think is an amazing career. And now I'm going to tell you my top 5 real quick because I've been rambling on forever. And I don't know if this made for an interesting podcast, but
it's worth it. I mean, you went through the whole thing. I mean, you got to document it. I mean, that's
document it.
Yeah.
So number 5 is Grumpy Old Men. It both represents his later stage career and his union with Jack Lemmon, his partnership with Jack Lemmon. Both very important and what he's most known for, I think, by most people. I almost want to throw the front page in there just to get Billy Wilder in there as well. But he only made the 3 movies with Billy Wilder. I mean, he made just as many movies with his son. He made just as many movies with Herbert Ross. He made just as many movies with Michael Ritchie.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. Now, he did win his only Academy Award in a Billy Wilder movie, but he was also nominated for an Academy Award in a movie directed by Jack Lemmon, and he was nominated for an Academy Award in a movie directed by Herbert Ross. You could say that his Herbert Ross collaboration was just as important. I wouldn't, but you could. Number 4 is I'm Not Rappaport, which directed by Herb Gardner, who only directed this and The Goodbye People, which were both based on plays that he had written. I'm Not Rappaport is here because just the dialogue between him and Davis is so on point. This movie is such a great example of what it means to face your old age and how people younger than you will try to get you out of their sight so they don't have to deal with old age. I loved it. And I think this is just an even better representation of the end of his career. Number 3 is King Creole, which is the best movie of his early career, his pre-Charlie Varick career, his pre-Fortune Cookie career. It's not even so much because he's so great in it. He's good in it as a gangster, but it's just like a great movie with a great soundtrack, all done by Elvis, and important for Lynch fans to see before they see Blue Velvet. Number 2 is Hopscotch, which was the last gasp before a really rough run. And Charlie Varick is number 1, although I think I could swap these two. These are like bookends of the height of his career, of his, the middle of his career, the 70s, the late 60s, early 70s. So those are the 5. Those are the Mount Rushmore plus ahead of Walter Matthau. Charlie Varick, Hopscotch, King Creole, I'm Not Rappaport, Grumpy Old Men.
It's a good list. Good, strong list.
Thank you very much. And thank you for listening to me talk about Walter Matthau for Lord knows how long. I ate like 3 pieces of banana bread while I was doing this. Sorry, everybody. Thank you. I don't know. What do you think? You should do a project next. I was
just thinking, what's one that I could do? And I don't know. I'll come up with something.
Well, let's think. What are some options real quick?
Well, there's 2 that I've done that I never ended up finishing. One was all the best pictures in a row.
Mm-hmm.
I think that could be, that could be interesting. And I've also done one that would be a lot of bad movies. But there's the entire, I don't think WWE Studios is making movies anymore. And at one point I had seen most of those up until there's maybe 10 or 15 that I never ended up getting, but there's 60 of them. So that might be a fun kind of bad movie project.
The Walter Matthau project, ironically, was almost the exact same amount of movies as the Disney animated project. So maybe you could do the best picture project in 2 parts since it's time and a half. It's 90 some movies now, right?
96, yeah.
It should be done.
Agree.
If you want to know what is coming out next week, go to our Letterboxd profile. You can find me at Brad Garoon on Letterboxd. I think Jake, you're Jake Ziegler on Letterboxd.
Yep, it's Jake_Ziegler.
And both of us have pinned to our profiles our Never Did It podcast list. You could also just search for the Never Did It podcast list. And the 2 movies that will be discussed on next week's episode are always at the top of that list.
We have a Facebook page now as well. You can check that out at facebook.com/Never Did It podcast. I'll be posting on that with new episodes and just fun updates from time to time. time about what we're watching and what's coming up.
So check that out. And thank you for joining us for Never Did It.